Germans are bracing for a political earthquake this coming weekend as two states in the eastern part of the country hold regional elections that could see right-wing populists surpass mainstream parties to become the strongest political force in one or both states. A dramatic surge in support for the Alternative for Germany party, known by its German initials AfD, would send shockwaves that could upend politics not only in regional capitals, but also in Berlin. Nearly 30 years after the fall of the wall, it looks as though East and West could be growing further apart rather than together. Why that is our topic this week here on Quadriga, and here are our guests. Valerie Höhne works for Spiegel Online. She says German society is just beginning to deal with the disappointment and trauma Eastern Germans experienced after the fall of the wall. Many people felt their experiences had been ignored. The AfD feeds off these feelings of neglect. And it's a pleasure to welcome my colleague Michaela Küfner. She's chief political editor here at DW. She says most of all, these elections are about what options will be on the table when Angela Merkel's final coalition government leaves office. And we're very pleased to have Alan Posener back on the show. He's an author and commentator for the daily newspaper Die Welt. He says, a generation after the end of Nazism, West Germany experienced an anti-authoritarian youth revolt. A generation after the end of communism, East Germany's experiencing an authoritarian revolt led by old men. So let me ask all of you, and I'll start with you, Alan, if I may, to please explain for us the importance of these elections, because we're talking about two states, Brandenburg and Saxony, that in fact have just over 6 million residents altogether. That's well less than 10% of the German population. So why all the attention?
Well, firstly, because Germany is a federal state. So these states, just like, say, the United States, so these states may be, I mean, even a small state and a big state, they have a voice in the upper house of the German parliament, the Bundesrat, so it's important simply for constitutional reasons. The second is that if the AfD becomes the biggest party in one or both states, they may force the other parties into a kind of horrible hodgepodge coalition with the SPD, the CDU, with the Greens, the FDP, anyone who isn't AfD, and that mixing together in order not to form a coalition with the AfD, with the far right. And this would be terrible for democracy. It would be awful if this would lead to sort of stampede of democratic parties, sort of anything but AfD. It doesn't work. It only feeds their pride and would lead, I think, their people who wonder, should I vote, should I not vote in other regional elections, rather to vote for them in order to sort of teach the other parties a lesson.
Michaela, can you just pick up on that? Your opening statement said that, in effect, the shockwaves of a surge in support for the AfD would be felt in the capital, Berlin, as well as in the states themselves. Why is that? Is this kind of a litmus test for the two mainstream parties, the Conservatives and the Social Democrats?
Well, in a way, it's a fast forward of the decline that we've already seen in the past general elections that may well be on the horizon, particularly for Angela Merkel's junior coalition partner, the Social Democrat SPD, who have been having waves of nervous breakdowns politically over the past couple of years and who are very much struggling to actually somehow stay within this coalition. If they get another slap in the face at the ballot box, that could well set off a chain of events that would see Angela Merkel's self-declared final term in office come to an early halt. So that's what's at stake nationally.
Let's just spell that out. The SPD has been governing, in fact, ever since reunification as the leading party in Brandenburg.
Yes.
You're telling us if they lose that status this coming Sunday, we could well see, them pull out of the federal coalition, early elections?
I don't think one single event will be enough. I think it's just as interesting to see whether they actually, how far below the double digits they go in the neighbouring state of Saxony, because if they, in the worst-case scenario, fail the 5% threshold, that would be a complete catastrophe. It's such a loss of political status, and we're already seeing what essentially is a political standoff between the SPD now interim leadership. They're currently in a leadership struggle, seeing almost 24 candidates going for that top role. So that could see a standoff between kind of the established leadership and the grassroots of the party. And we're really seeing a party struggling to keep itself together, let alone the coalition government.
Now let's go back to these two states themselves, Valerie, Höhne, and we've just heard this is a litmus test, in a sense, for the federal government. Is it also a litmus test for reunification 30 years after the fact?
Oh, I wouldn't say that. I think reunification, there has been so much migration within Germany. I think almost 5 million people, they moved from Western Germany to Eastern Germany and vice versa, obviously, too. So I do think that the country is united, but there are still many issues in which you can actually see that Eastern Germany is still not as far along as Western Germany in regards to economical status, financial security, all of these things. And obviously also politically, the AfD is much stronger in these states than it is in Western states. But I have to say, I don't agree with you on that it would be a catastrophe for democracy if the left party and the CDU went into a coalition in Brandenburg. I think it's actually quite interesting.
Well, catastrophes for democracy often are interesting, but they're catastrophes nonetheless. What you need in a democracy is a balance between right and left. And if you have the CDU really forming a coalition with what used to be the communist governmental party in East Germany, just to prevent to avoid going into a coalition with the AfD, then I think democracy really is being stood on its head. And it, interesting though it might be to see it stood on its head, that's not something I'd like. It would also be hypocritical, because quite frankly, the AfD is not worse than the Left Party. They're both pseudo-totalitarian, anti-democratic, anti-Western, anti-NATO, anti-European parties.
I don't agree with that.
May I just come back to the question of reunification and the success of reunification? Valerie Höhne has said that in many ways East and West absolutely have integrated and converged. But Michaela, if we look at surveys, recent surveys, we see significant divergences in political attitudes. For example, one survey shows a great deal less support for democracy itself in the East than in the West. I think it's 2% of East Germans said they're enthusiastic about democracy, compared with 75% of West Germans. To what do you attribute that kind of divergence and, in fact, less than half support in East Germany for the system itself?
Well, essentially because in the eastern part, democracy didn't deliver the goods. It delivered new roads, it delivered infrastructure, but it killed tens of thousands of jobs. And I think it's safe to say that for East Germans who saw this complete turnaround of their political system in '89, the price was a very high one to pay. And there's a lot of debate in Germany about these broken biographies, people who never really found their feet professionally again after this essential breach of what they thought was kind of a path towards or within safe jobs. I mean, that's one thing that East Germany did deliver. Right now, the government is discussing, and that will probably go ahead, a package worth 40 billion euros to pay for restructuring of industry related to coal. Most of that will be in these eastern states. Just to put it into perspective, the finance minister reckons that a crisis the size of the financial crisis would cost Germany 50 billion euros. So that is a lot of money that is now sent east. But the experience of people in the east is that money didn't really solve their structural problems.
I want to come back to the economics in just a moment. But Alan, looking at your opening statement, talking about an authoritarian revolt, say a little bit, if you would, about political attitudes in the East. What did you mean by that? And does that mean you see this far-right party, the AfD, as an authoritarian party?
Yes. I'd like to go back to what you said, because to say that democracy didn't deliver is simply wrong. Of course we delivered. We delivered democracy itself. We delivered freedom of speech. We delivered freedom of movement. We delivered freedom of expression. We delivered a party democracy, which works, as proved by the fact that the AfD and the old left are allowed to take part in parliamentary elections. The whole point, if I make my if I say, "Oh, I'm for democracy as long as I'm okay, as long as the economy is okay," then I'm not a Democrat, and that's the trouble with the Germans generally. In 1933, when in 1932-33, when the economy went downhill, the Americans voted Franklin D. Roosevelt, and the Germans voted Hitler. And now, from 33 to 89. East Germany was under fascist, then communist rule. They didn't know anything about democracy. They never learned about democracy. They weren't taught about democracy. And now they're revolting against democracy, and it's the old men who never bothered, who never questioned themselves, who in fact agreed with the system, who'd made their peace with the system. Now they found another outlet for their horrible anti-democratic attitudes. It's just a terrible, terrible thing. We were much too lenient on them after reunification.
But Alan, you're actually, that's exactly the point. This is the thing that East Germans resent. If you travel to Saxony, to them, democracy didn't deliver on their expectations.
Well, that's their fault. They expected the wrong thing.
What they feel they were promised. And the last thing they want right now from politicians is to be lectured on how democratic they are and whether their opinion is valid or not. And this is exactly what leads to such broad support for the far-right AfD. Whether you agree with it or not, it's a phenomenon and it's there.
And I think that they want their experiences to be validated. They want these broken biographies, as you called them, to be seen by the mainstream of Germany and mainstream media, to just be part of Germany and be seen as like part of it, and not as this weird sort of cast-off flyover country. But
I just want to ask one thing about a point that is often asserted in connection with political attitudes and support for the AfD, namely the idea that it reflects the communist era socialization of older Germans, and even a kind of nostalgia for an easier time. Do you think that's true, Valerie?
Yeah, definitely. And I also think that Germans weren't good Democrats in the 50s. They weren't good Democrats in the 60s. They had the economic wonder, that's Wirtschaftswunder, and that's how, and that went on until like the 70s. And so that's how they became Democrats, is because the U.S. forced it upon them, and then they had a good experience with democracy, so it stuck, sort of, you know, to put it in a nutshell. And that didn't happen in Eastern Germany. Obviously, they got all this money, they got all this restructuring of infrastructure, of streets and so forth, but they didn't have the experience that they were the creators of this.
Well, they weren't, were they?
Well, yeah, but I think that that's part of the problem.
Well,
and
the reason they
never
weren't.
went to school.
Let me just make a cut here, because we do have a little report that will allow us to dig a bit deeper on the economic aspects of unification. And perhaps many remember during the election campaign that directly followed the fall of the Berlin Wall, then Chancellor Helmut Kohl promised East Germans that they would see their region blossom. Now, unemployment has fallen dramatically since the 90s. Wages and salaries are rising, and many of the region's cities are booming. Yet ongoing dissatisfaction very much is driving support for right-wing populism.
November 9th, 1989. The Berlin Wall comes down and the Iron Curtain parts. Barely 11 months later, Germany is reunified. But the flourishing landscapes the leaders promised haven't materialized. Instead, Eastern German industry has been languishing. More than 1 million Eastern Germans are out of work. Western Germany still dominates the economy. Not a single DAX-listed corporation is based in the East. In 2015, the refugee crisis brings feelings of discontent in the East to critical mass. Increasingly, migrants are seen as competitors for both jobs and social benefits. 2 billion euros of investment are helping the East to catch up with the West. But at around 7%, unemployment is still above the average in the West. Are Eastern Germans second-class citizens?
Let me put that question to Michaela. Are Eastern Germans second-class citizens?
The question that matters when individuals go into a polling booth is whether they feel that they are second-class citizens. And Saxony is the economically most successful eastern state. And that's where the AfD is likely to come out potentially as the strongest party. That's where the CDU, now there's a margin of 5-6%. The CDU is ahead. They're getting a bit more relaxed about it. But where there's a real race between Angela Merkel's CDU party regionally and the far-right AfD. So many feel second-class citizen. It's a generational question very much as well. But if you look at a map of how much disposable income there is, you can still quite clearly see where the wall stood between East and West Germany. And that is where this entire part of the country lags behind, that also can't put down a payment for their kids in central Berlin, as many West Germans do. And this all has an impact on how people feel in the East. And it's a very emotive election campaign, that's for sure.
Alan, I'm sure that many of our viewers, and certainly all of us here, will remember that famous Bill Clinton quote from one of his own election campaigns when he said, "It's the economy, stupid," meaning it always comes down to the pocketbook. Now, here's another paradox. In surveys, East Germans express levels of personal economic satisfaction pretty much comparable with those in the West. So what's going on here? Is this second-class feeling about something other than economics?
Yeah, it's the economy stupid is a stupid phrase, and Clinton should have known that. People vote, but let's not go into that. It's the demography stupid. Look, before the wall went up in 1961, the educated people, the doctors, the university professors, engineers, they all left the country with their potential offspring. Then, between 61 and the wall coming down, 89, anyone who was courageous enough, who felt strong enough about democracy to leave, chanced it. Since 1989, people have seen chances in the West and gone there. You have a brain drain, a drain of people who feel for democracy, with the civic spirit, courage. And what's left, quite frankly, they may be first-class citizens as far as their rights are concerned, but no, yes, they are a negative selection of the German population. Let's face it, they're stupider than the others, and that's why more of them are voting for stupid parties.
Oh, I don't think that's true. And
statistically, not individually.
We've seen in the past few years there's actually been migration back to Eastern Germany, and it's actually growing.
Well, yeah, because they need people, don't they, who are not so stupid. And also, I mean, they're not allowing immigration in. We're getting this huge influx of people with the get-up-and-go spirit from Syria, from Africa, everywhere. They're saying, no, we don't want them, because they want to stew in their own juice, and they feel happy like that. They're like little Englanders. They're like the Trump supporters. They're people who are a negative selection. There's going to have to be a demographic solution to this, because, thank goodness, some young people are going back to the East, and maybe they have a better view of things.
Let me just ask you this. Certainly there has been massive depopulation in some areas of the East, and a number of surveys show a correlation between support for the far right and areas where depopulation has occurred. And that is not confined to Germany alone. We're seeing a similar phenomenon in the US and other places where there is increasing support for the right wing. But here's another paradox for me. In precisely the same areas, there is a great deal of resentment against migration, when in fact those areas theoretically need immigration more than any other places in the country. Valerie, how would you explain that?
Yeah, I'm stumped. I don't understand that either. I also don't understand the inherent racism that is privy to most of these places. So I feel like I really don't understand that. Also because the Eastern Germans you'd think that a lot of them understand how the West helped Eastern Germany after the fall of the wall, so maybe they could, they'd be more open to migration, but that is clearly not the case. I think it's, you know, studies have shown that if you don't have migration, you're more critical to it. And Eastern Germany didn't have migration, and that from the socialistic brother countries, those were only a few, and they were very much kept separate from the public. So they weren't even allowed to really interact. So there was never any basis of sort of understanding of multiculturalism. I think that's a big part.
Michaela, tell us a little bit about the role of the AfD in connection with anti-migration sentiment. In fact, it's become an absolute signature issue for the AfD. What's driving that?
Well, because it clearly resonated with voters and the opinion polls. The AfD started out being an anti-Euro party. It then took a turn to the right, and now arguably to the very far right in parts. And it was almost vanishing from the political scene when 2015 came around, what became known as the migration crisis in Germany. You can really follow that line quite easily, and they fast discovered, and the AfD leadership will admit so in individual conversations, that is the issue that made them big, being anti-migration. They're anti-Islam. They've toned down their rhetoric to a certain degree because they discovered the opportunity of saying we are the real people, picking up on slogans of those protests in 1989. And they are giving people a voice who feel that they couldn't be openly against foreigners and they couldn't openly be racist. And that certainly is something where the public debate in Germany has taken a turn for the worse.
So the AfD, Alan, instrumentalizing anti-foreigner sentiment for the sake of the issue itself, or for the sake of political power and perhaps also driving opposition to the so-called elite in Berlin?
Well, you'd have to ask them, wouldn't you? I mean, I know some AfD people, like, for instance, Alexander Gauland, who is almost a friend of mine. He's not an inherent racist, but he uses it, right? On the other hand, what's his name? Björn Höcke in Thuringia, he is a racist through and through. So, and Gauland is working with him together in the same party. I mean, look, again, August Bebel, the founder of the Social Democratic Party, said anti-Semitism is the socialism of the stupid guys. And racism of all kinds is the socialism of the stupid guys. Right? It's pointing down to other people who are even below me in social status and declaring war on them. And this is stupid, right? And so a party which appeals to stupid sentiment and gets 20% obviously thinks, this is what the AfD thinks, that 20% of the people in the East are stupid. And if they get the election results, then they'll be proved right. But it's up to these Germans to prove them wrong, not up to us sitting here in the studio pontificating.
But what does that make Alexander Gauland, then, who you say is not a racist?
That makes him a horrible, opportunistic person who's using that party for his own ends to get his own back on Angela Merkel, who is never, he's never, by the way, an East German. So there are others. There are others.
Valerie?
That's true. Also, there's a lot of innovation in the East. I really don't want to let that stand, that the Eastern Germans are more stupid than the Western Germans. I don't think that's true.
They have a higher proportion of stupid people.
Well, the demography is different. A lot of people who saw chances left. They left. That's what you said. And so there is this brain drain, obviously, and the 90s were really hard, and there were lots of Nazis that weren't addressed in the GDR, and so there are all these issues, and they're accumulating to what we're now seeing.
Let me just ask you this, because we're almost out of time, and I'd like to at least briefly hear from all of you. Should the far right, in fact, make significant gains in the elections on Sunday, what do governments at both regional and federal level need to be doing to stop this trend? And I'm going to have to ask for the briefest of possible answers.
Well, they are a democratic party. They need to be demystified by being seen what they are, and that might see them in a regional government somewhere in the near future, but they are nowhere near being in power in central government. I would just advise parties not to change the rules to avoid them. That's also part of democracy.
Thank you. Alan?
Can I just say I agree?
Certainly.
That never happens.
That leaves a lot of time for Valerie. A lot being about 30 seconds.
Right, exactly. Well, I do think that it's important that they don't get in power even in Saxony or Brandenburg, and I think that the Democratic parties should have a little more faith in society and themselves, and I very much hope that we're going to see them decline over the next couple of months and years.
Thank you very much to all of you for being with us today. And thanks to you out there for tuning in. Hope to see you soon. Bye-bye.